Welcome to the University of San Francisco. This is the Silk Lectures featuring Nobel Laureates. And normally Jeff Silk would do the introductions, but he's asked me to do it tonight, and I hope I can do my best to substitute him. The purpose of this series is to allow students, faculty, and staff at USF, as well as those in the outside community, to have access to great avenues of thought, as evidenced by people who have changed the world with their ideas. Very few people ever meet a Nobel Prize winner or hear their ideas in person. With the Silk Lectures featuring Nobel laureates, we want to change that. The structure tonight shall be a 45-minute lecture with a 30 to 35-minute Q&A, and we have lots of questions that were given to us by audience members, so please bear with us as we go through those. Before I introduce our guest speaker, we'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight. We'd like to thank the CFA members for coming tonight and the CFA for working with us to offer these events to their members, especially Ann O'Brien. We thank the students that helped organize this event tonight, especially Marcus, Davis, Andrea, and Divya, the staff of USF like Jazz Johnson, Sam Bethel, William Kay, and Stephanie Dixon for making everything go smoothly. Most importantly, I want to thank Jeff Silk, Naomi Silk, and the Silk family. They continue to contribute to this university and make the University of San Francisco a better place and make the world a better place through education. We also have the president of USF, Father Paul, here, and the provost of USF, Don Heller, and I want to thank you for supporting us. Could we please give a hand for the Silk family? Could we give a hand for the University of San Francisco and making the world a better place? Thank you. One other thing, please turn off your cell phones and don't use them while the speaker is speaking. So I want you to picture the year 1981. It's been just a few years since Eugene Fama has written about definitions of market efficiency. A young Bob Shiller asked a simple question. Do stock prices reflect the future payments of what you get from those stocks? That is the stock market rational? He concludes that it's not really. Every graduate student in economics and finance encounters that paper sometime or later. A few years later, Bob Shiller and his former student John Campbell asked, do market price to earnings predict future stock returns? They find that when the market price to the earnings of the stock market is too high, the stock market generally falls. This has now become the very popular measure of market valuation called the CAPE ratio. Even talk show hosts know about it. Not yet with politicians, but it's moving there. It's now March 2000. Bob Shiller releases a book called Irrational Exuberance. It says that the market is wildly overvalued and will probably fall. The NASDAQ drops by 33% 1 month later, and by 77% in the next 2.5 years. The book became a bestseller. Now, Bob, you have to admit that was a little bit lucky. Our guest speaker has also developed the famous Case-Shiller home price indices along with Carl Case. They've allowed a lot of people, including myself, to examine a reliable home market indicator to see how housing prices are moving in the world. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2013. He is currently the Sterling Professor of Economics at Yale University. He obtained his BA from the University of Michigan, his MS and PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Today, he will discuss his main work on deviations from market efficiency that helped him receive the Nobel Prize and his new book on narrative economics. Could you please give a warm welcome for Dr. Robert Shiller?
Well, thank you for that. Is my mic on? It doesn't sound. Thank you for that introduction. It was unusual going through various lucky moments I had in my life. And thank you for the tour I got of your campus, and it's a beautiful day, and so far it's been a wonderful experience for me. I'm going to talk about my new book. Actually, Ludwig asked me to talk about my earlier work that you referred to a little bit. So I'm actually talking about two books that I've written. This one, called Narrative Economics, came out October 1, so it's brand new. But before that, almost 20 years earlier, I wrote a book called, as you noted, Irrational Exuberance. And that kind of leads into, I actually liked it. I might use this idea of yours in future talks, because it gives a train of thought for me. Although it actually goes back to when I was a freshman, I think, in college, thinking about economics and people. That's maybe another title for. So I'm going to talk about irrational exuberance, which went through that's the first point, went through three editions, 2000, 2005, and 2015. And then what was hinted at in that book but didn't get developed was the role of stories in people's thinking and economic behavior, which goes even beyond the financial markets. And I'm going to talk about adaptations from other fields. Surprisingly, I'm going to talk about medical epidemiology, because I think stories go viral. And you know what virus means? That's a disease. And so they've been studying epidemics in the medical school for over 100 years. So maybe we can learn something from them. That's the idea. And the theme of this lecture will be that there are stories that are like viruses. They're not always so bad. They could be good, but they spread by contagion. And the dynamics of these are imparted to the whole economy. It's not just goofy internet memes. It's big ideas are spread like viruses. And then briefly I'll talk about the future of narrative economics. So let me start with one about irrational exuberance. I've got all three editions shown here. The timing, again, remember, you're right, I was just lucky to time each of these editions for some bubble somewhere. So in the first edition, I call it the Millennium Boom, the stock market had been really booming, and then it crashed the same month that my book came out, so I was sometimes blamed for the crash. The second book was Irrational, second edition, came during what I call, and it hasn't caught on, called the Ownership Society Boom. But it was a real estate home price bubble, which it came out in 2005, and it didn't really burst suddenly then, but it kind of did. It slowed down and crashed right after my book. So this is, you're right, it's just luck. I did predict it, but hesitantly, but I did. The third edition, it's amazing. I always come up with new bubbles. I don't know what I'll do in my fourth edition. I haven't. But this was the bond market bubble, which is represented by near zero interest rates. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the figures from these books. This is the stock market in the United States. Basically, the S&P 500 average going back to 1871. The blue line. And this was in a paper I wrote in 1981 in the American Economic Review. What I added to the plot, this is just a standard plot of real inflation-corrected stock prices for the United States. But what I added with these other lines in my 1981 paper, which is what the stock market would have been if there were no timing issues, that it always paid the same return, and people knew the future with certainty. So it's called the present value of future dividends paid on the stocks. And so the theory says that the efficient markets theory then common in finance was that the stock price is the best possible forecast of the present value. And so These are two different. The problem that I had is I don't know what happened after. I won't know what will happen after. This is actually from my Nobel lecture, this slide. So I was lecturing in 2013, and I didn't know the future after 2013. So I had to make some assumptions about it. You don't know what the present value will be until infinite time has gone by, but you get a pretty good idea. Anyway, what I'm showing here, this got a lot of attention when I published it and got me into all sorts of fights. People saying this is wrong or something. There's nothing wrong with this. If people knew the future with certainty, this is what the stock market would have done. So what is going on with this blue line? It's jumping up all over and going down all over the place. So that was a challenge to the idea that economists had become very popular with economists, that the world is very perfect. The story of efficient markets is that there's so many smart people out there. They virtually know the future. Well, they may not know, but they're doing optimal forecasting. And I look at this and say, how can this be optimal forecasting? Because what's being predicted is almost like a trend line. And they're jumping all over the place. This is 1929, by the way. And this is after it lost 86% of its value. What was happening? I thought it had something to do with people. Lo and behold, we can't ignore people in these events. So this just shows the dividends paid on the S&P 500 back to 1871. And they're pretty trendy. They jump around a lot, but the present value shouldn't respond to short-run jumps. So it just doesn't look right. And these are some other present values with time-varying interest rates. The blue line is the same. It's the value of the stock market from 1871 until the Nobel event 2013. So you can discount by time-varying interest rates. It doesn't do you any good. It still doesn't work. Or you can discount by consumption data. And it just doesn't look efficient. There's no thing that shows that the stock market was ever right. So that was the challenge that made me. Let me just go back here. This is 1929, and the stock market crashed. So some people would say, wasn't that rational? They kind of saw the depression. But look at what happened to the actual optimal forecast. The present value didn't decline very much at all. And you say, well, wait a minute, that was the Great Depression. It had to be horrible, right? I got some news for you. It wasn't horrible. That's just somebody's story that they told you. And they love good stories. You know, that's human nature. So I start out by saying, the Great Depression wasn't so bad. Okay. I got in trouble. I was on a radio broadcast, and somebody called in and was really angry. And she said, I remember the Great Depression, and I was hungry. So I checked it out. There was some malnutrition. I shouldn't have said it, that it wasn't so bad. But they had soup kitchens, and they fed kids at school, and they weren't starving. So it's kind of an in-between. Reality is boring. It's in-between. But stories are dramatic, and so we're always trying to be dramatic with our stories. So we don't want the Depression again. I'll reiterate that. So I moved to the housing market. This was my second edition. I added the housing market to my book because we were now having a huge boom in housing. So the blue line here is, since I could only go back to 1890, this is a home price index for the whole United States from 1890 until, this is until 2019, this year, in real terms corrected for inflation. And when I put this out, it really surprised some people because, first of all, between 1890 and 1990, there was almost no change in home prices. How can that be? Don't we all know that they always go up? Land is getting scarce. Well, it doesn't look. And then look what happened here. Wow. And so I was right. Oops. Oh, wait a minute. Now I'm having trouble getting back. There. This is when my book came out. And so I sometimes think I might have caused it, this correction. But nobody had ever plotted this before. No one ever came forward saying, this is 100 years of home pricing. So is that boring or what? But we're all making decisions on whether to buy a house. No one ever looked at it. It's amazing what people do and don't do. They're kind of herd-like, and they all do the same thing. Well, this is in one of your books. About crowding, you said? So why did this happen right here? Is it because of construction costs? Well, I have construction costs, an index of construction costs back to 1890. It wasn't doing anything. What about population growth? Well, here's the, there's a little, it slowed down during the Great Depression and World War II. Pretty boring looking series, mostly. Although we try to tell dramatic stories about it. And this is the interest rate. None of these things suggest an answer why home prices did that. So I'm inclined to think that it's something in our way of thinking. Our stories changed through time. So I thought you might want to know locally. So I've got West Coast. As you noted in the introduction, we have our own home price indices that are being produced now by CoreLogic. But these are West Coast cities: Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. And you can see that they all did more or less the same thing around the time of the housing bubble. Some more than others. Los Angeles is the most dramatic. San Francisco is right up there, and San Diego. So what is it? Why did some cities get more volatile than others? That's a deep question, but I think it has something to do. The ones that went up the most were the ones with the best stories, I think. Hollywood is up there at the top. The third edition I came out with the bonds, discussing the bond bubble, which is the black line is long-term 10-year interest rates, and you can see how low they got, which means the price is high for a bond. Is it because of something rational like inflation expectation? So I computed the actual future inflation as of various dates, and I computed the last 10 years, the preceding 10 years inflation. So the efficient markets theory says that the future inflation should be incorporated into the bond price, the bond yield. But it's not. It's the lagged inflation. So the bond market seems to be doing exactly the wrong thing. It's looking not at nobody knows how to forecast inflation 10 years. They just look at the past. So it seemed like it had something to do with the cutting of interest rates. I'm going through this kind of fast. I could spend a lot more time on my previous book. I'm trying to do 2 books in one lecture. So if this was a little fuzzy to you, I'll move on to something now that's a little bit less technical, my new book, which doesn't actually have any mathematics in it except in the appendix, which you don't have to read. So behavioral economics was a revolution over the last 30 years, bringing psychology into economics. And you have courses on that here, I understand. So I'm defining what might be a subset of behavioral economics, or it's just a new field. It looks at human economic behavior that is caused by changes in popular narratives. So let me just stop and talk what I'm talking about. Economists like to hypothesize that people are maximizing their expected utility subject to a budget constraint. And I think that's in some approximate sense true. But in another sense, they don't sound like they're doing that. So, for example, can anyone remember a dinner conversation with other friends in which you talked about what is the optimal amount I should be saving from my income for my retirement? I've never been in such a discussion. And yet we're supposed to be doing it. So I think we should look about what we actually talk about at dinner. And what is that? it's gossip, right? One sort or another, or dramatic stories that you saved up for this occasion. And you want to, so that has to be driving people's changes in thinking. That's the idea. Now, this idea that narratives are important is not original with me. Lots of social scientists, journalists, politicians seem to know this. The only people who don't seem to know it are the finance academics and the econ department people. So, but let me just say, what is a narrative? It's sometimes thought to be synonymous with story. But actually, I would say it has a subtle connotation which is different. A narrative is a telling of a story that imbues it with some significance, either as a dramatic example of what can happen, so it's explaining the world, or it has some moral implications, patriotic implications, something that moves your feelings. So what I want to do is study the stories. And this is something that is hard to do because there's so many of them. But it will focus on those that I call economic narratives, which are narratives that imply certain kinds of economic actions. They occur. So another thing to say is, an example, a sociologist went to a prison hoping to talk to the prisoners about their philosophy of life. Okay? And started by asking, what is your philosophy of life? And didn't get very satisfying answers because they just didn't want to talk about that. But then they found out the way to get an answer from them is to point to some other prisoner and say, what did he do? What got him in here? And they all know what everybody else did to get in jail. And they will tell you an animated story about him. And it implies that they have some moral judgments or some... it has to be put in the form of a story, and then they can get it. So we have to study the stories. That's my claim. And they tend to occur in constellations. I'll give you the most obvious example of a constellation of narratives is narratives about Donald J. Trump. Whether you like him or not, haven't you been hearing more about him than you think you really need to know? That's a constellation of narratives. A confluence of narratives is a little different. It's not related to each other, but maybe all pushing people to do the same thing and then to cause some economic issue. So I think we can quantify narratives. We can start trying to do that, but this is a research proposal for future decades. This is evidence on how often people talk about. Now we have digitized text now, so we can search around for what people are talking about, at least in certain formal things like newspapers or magazines. We can't observe day-to-day conversations. They're lost forever. But we can observe some clues. So I looked for scholarly articles in journals for mentions of the word narrative on JSTOR, which is a database of scholarly journals. And the black line is the percent of articles since the history of these, it goes back maybe 100 years for some journals, the percent of articles that contain the word narrative. And the gray line is the same, but for the last 10 years. Well, the thing that jumps out at me is finance is the worst. Even though we have all these bubbles and events, they don't talk about narrative. And the second worst is economics. On top of that, all of them show greater attention to narratives for the last 10 years. So it's growing. I think that you hear about narratives when you read the newspaper. You just don't bring it up during a finance seminar. So another thing about this book, I have a chapter entitled An Adventure in Consilience. It was sort of, I decided to try to read more widely and incorporate different scraps of wisdom into the book. That picture here is William Whewell, who was a professor of philosophy at Cambridge University in the early 19th century. And he coined the word consilience. It was later elaborated on by E.O. Wilson, who is an entomologist, studies insects. Wilson said, the consilience means the unity of knowledge among the differing academic disciplines, especially between the sciences and the humanities. So we need to listen to our English professors, or our French literature professors, or our history professors, in order to help us do important work. That's the theme. So it brings me to epidemiology. You wouldn't think that we would talk about. So for a moment, let's just switch over. Imagine that we're in the medical school or the nursing school or something like that. Now we're talking about a real disease, a bad one, called Ebola. You've heard about this. Stay away from it. Okay? You don't want to get this one. But it's had repeated outbreaks in Africa. And here's an epidemic curve for one of them, collected by the Center for Disease Control. It shows that suddenly, these are reported cases of Ebola. This village, or this county of Nigeria, had not had any cases until this week, when there was something like, 12 or 13 cases in the county. And then they started growing, not every week, but they're going up. And it went up for about 10 weeks. And then it was partly because of mitigation efforts. Medical people started arriving courageously. You don't want to go there. In fact, some of them lost their lives for that. But they did it, and it brought the contagion rate down. And then it eventually just disappeared. It's gone in that area. So when it was rising, it was the contagion rate greater than the recovery rate. And then all it takes is a little blip downward in the contagion rate. Could be weather change or these sort of things. People are not getting together as much and not meeting each other, or they're being more careful because they've heard somewhere that this is dangerous. So the contagion rate goes down below the recovery rate. And then you still get new cases, but at lower and lower rates, and then it's gone. So the same thing can be applied to narratives or going viral. All of these internet memes that go viral, they go up for a while and then they peter away too. And then years later, most people have forgotten them. So recovery becomes forgetting. So that's the model I want to use for epidemics. So here's a couple examples of epidemics that follow this curve. You ever heard of Bitcoin? Can I get a show of how many people have never heard of Bitcoin? So this is a bad epidemic. It reached almost 100% of the population. So, and it follows. This plot goes from 1850 to I guess I stopped at 2018, or maybe it was 2019. But it's showing the same hump-shaped curve. It's kind of compressed because I've got over 100 years shown here. But it looks like an epidemic. Why is it happening? Nobody knows. I'll say one thing about it. It's cool. It's computer science. It's coming at a time when people are worried about losing their jobs to computers. It's a time when university courses all over the country are shifting, students are shifting to the computer science department because they think this is the future. So maybe it has something to do with it. It's stories about, well, it's also the story about Bitcoin. It's about a man named Satoshi Nakamoto who invented it, but nobody knows where he is. Nobody has met him. You say, how can that possibly be? Well, apparently Satoshi Nakamoto started emailing people, trying to get them interested in starting Bitcoin. And he never showed his face. They gave him Bitcoin. But who knows? He never came by and said anything. It's a mystery story. It's a great story. So I'm going to compare that with another episode, which you all remember, right? Bimetallism. It looks like the same epidemic curve again. But this one is centered in the 1890s. So I'll tell you what bimetallism is. Bimetallism is a theory that the government should go off the gold standard and go to a gold and silver standard at a ratio of 16 to 1 between gold and silver. which would cause maybe 100% inflation. But it's good. We need inflation, okay, in 1890s. It was the depression of the 1890s, right centered on this. And people at that time thought that the bimetallism narrative had started that depression by creating great uncertainty. But you might ask, how can that possibly be an epidemic? What's interesting about, I mean, maybe for the economics department or the finance department, they could debate going on to bimetallic standard. But it just doesn't sound very interesting. Well, but it was interesting. Here's an example of how they made it interesting. You own this book, by the way. You can search for it on your cell phone because its copyright has expired. It was a 1 million copy bestseller in 1894 called Coins Financial School. Anyone here read it? Nobody had read it. But you can now read it. It's a story about this boy whose name is Coin. How old does he look here? He's a boy. He's not a man. And somehow these rich financiers are listening to him. It never really explained why they came and listened to him lecture on bimetallism. But they tried to raise objections to him. That's what the story is about. And he always outsmarts them. So I think emotionally, it's just the Bitcoin story again. These are establishment, drab figures. And this boy just absolutely outsmarts them. It was the young people who were excited. They thought these old fogies don't know anything. We're going to change finance forever with a new money. It is sort of, you should try to read it. It's fun to get this perspective. Things were different. This is an epidemic curve from mathematical epidemiology textbooks. And it shows what happens in a typical disease epidemic. But I think it's the same as what we see in economic narratives. This is a theoretical epidemic, these bar lines. This is the number of susceptibles, and this is the number of recovereds. This is the Kermack-McKendrick model published in 1927. But epidemics start really slowly because they start from a small base. It's very contagious, but so this is an example where there's only one person sick at the beginning in week 1. So the initial infectives is only 1 in a million. And it goes up, way up, and then it comes down. And that's how epidemics end. So I'm claiming that we have epidemics like this that occur with ideas, and then they change the world. So I really think the depression of the 1890s, which you've probably never heard of, because it was a narrative for a while, and it just lost it. You don't remember that. You remember the depression of the 1930s. I'm sure many of you do, because that one has been more successful and contagion. Economists don't study these narratives. And I think the main reason why they don't is they think that this is just fluff, this is just talk. We want to focus on real economic forces that drive markets. And they think that these don't cause anything, these just are people's talk, it means nothing. So I wanted to argue that there is reason to expect it to be causal, because outside of economics, many controlled experiments have been run that show that people's judgment is affected by human interest, colorful narratives. So in marketing, journalism, education, health, philanthropy, and law. So in journalism, they teach you this in journalism school. They say when you're writing a news article, don't just quote statistics. No one will pay attention to you. Start with a story about John and Mary Smith, who had a real problem, and then you tell a little human interest story, get their attention, and then buried down you can say there is some professor somewhere who knows this is statistics about this. But you want the story. Oh, law, this article, they did mock jury experiments where they had students pretending they were a jury in a court of law, and they had the prosecution give one of two arguments. The first was bland, and the second one was vivid. And so the vivid was embellished with vivid details that don't mean anything for the case, but they just put them in there. So in one case, they had a line added to the prosecution's argument. The accused lunged at the victim, knocking over a bowl of guacamole dip upside down on the white shag carpet. Now that has to be totally irrelevant, but they got more convictions with that story. So we know, this is research with controlled experiments, that narratives do affect human judgment. And to me, it's about what are people talking about anyway? If we're trying to explain their changes in behavior, we have to look at what they talk about. So I mentioned Donald J. Trump. But it's the same thing. In the 1890s, a reporter was traveling through the by the way, the bimetallism was actually very polarizing in the 1890s, because most people who lived in the Midwest of the United States believed in bimetallism, and the people out east, there weren't as many people in California then. There were a lot, I guess. But the people in the Midwest were stupid. I'm saying that's what the Easterners said. The Midwesterners were really annoyed to be dismissed as stupid. And so when a reporter traveled through the Midwest, these people wanted to talk about bimetallism. And they were so sure that they had this neat thing. They just read Coyne's Financial School, and they knew all about it. And they wanted to talk about it. So it had a feeling similar to what we have with Bitcoin, which is accused of being stupid by New York financiers. Although in Silicon Valley, they love it, right? The same epidemic curve is followed by economic models. So I took some famous economic models, the ISLM model, the real business cycle model, the overlapping generations model, and the multiplier accelerator model. They're all hump-shaped like an epidemic curve. It's because people just forget. They lose it. The human interest is lost. So for example, in 1939, Paul Samuelson published the multiplier accelerator model. Just like a natural epidemic, there was almost no mention of it until 12, 13 years later, and now suddenly he had a moment of glory, or a decade of glory, and then he died. we lost him. We're not talking about him anymore. So the whole thing just gets forgotten. He was a good man, but that's what happened. Now another example is the Laffer curve. Now the older people among you haven't heard of it, right?
I heard of it.
You've heard of it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's because it's coming back, though. I'm proud of you that you've heard of it. But in 1974, Arthur Laffer, who is an economist, had dinner with Dick Cheney, the Vice President of the United States, the big shot, and Donald Rumsfeld, maybe that was later, he was Vice President, but Donald Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense. So he was having dinner with the real big shots in Washington. And he drew this diagram on a napkin. It's called the Laffer curve. And the diagram is about what kind of government revenues the government can expect to get if they choose an income tax rate anywhere in this range from 0 to 100%. So Laffer said if you choose 0% tax rate, you're going to get no revenue, right? Obviously, you won't collect any taxes. But he said if you do 100% up here, oops. Wait a minute, what's going on? Now I can't advance it. What did I do? Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, if I do 100%, you won't collect any revenue either. So there must be a hump-shaped curve between 0 and 100%. And then he said, if we have to collect 1,000 in revenue, or whatever, there's always 2 tax rates that will do the same amount. This is the Democratic Party tax rate, A. That's the Republican Party. So it's like a joke. It's just, So this is the course. It was told in a narrative form by Jude Wanniski, who was a writer for the Wall Street Journal, and had a best-selling book called The Way the World Works. And nobody knew about it until later, and then it boomed and then it came down like an epidemic curve. But something is bringing it back now. Now that might be Donald J. Trump. It's connected with him. Because it justifies cutting taxes on the rich. And then it'll all trickle down and help the economy and everyone will be better off. It's kind of related to the Laffer curve. Well, this is famous economists mentions in Google, and you should get onto Google. It's books.google.com/ngrams, and you can search any sequence of words up to 4 words, and it will tell you. You can extend it even before 1800. How often they were mentioned in books. So these are famous economists, and here, look at this guy. You all know and love him. He's the most famous economist in the world, Henry George. You haven't. Because he went the way of any epidemic curve and faded away. But he's still alive. At least I've gotten 2 invitations to speak to, and I did it twice, to Henry George clubs. He still has clubs in his honor. But they all follow the same hump-shaped pattern. So in my book, I talk about a number of narratives with the theme that the narratives are... a lot of them are perennial, the same narrative return. I'm counting Bitcoin and bimetallism as the same narrative. Well, there's another one that I should have mentioned. In the Great Depression, someone wanted to have electronic money. But this is different than you think now. Electronic money would be claims on watt hours, and we would shift from the dollar to the watt. Okay? They just like people like cool things and stories. So here are some cool stories. Panic versus confidence, frugality versus conspicuous consumption. I mentioned the gold standard in bimetallism. Labor-saving machines replace many jobs. Automation and artificial intelligence replace almost all jobs. Real estate booms and busts. Stock market bubbles. Boycotts, profiteers, and evil business. And the wage price spiral and evil labor unions. So I'm not going to cover all that. I'm just going to give some examples and then stop. Panic versus confidence. Here I'm searching on Google Ngrams for the Panic of 1837. That's the black line. The Panic of 1857. Right? You remember all these, right? The Panic of 1873. These were all, and 93 and 1907. These were all banking panics. And part of the story was there's a bank run. And here's what happens. You're having dinner with someone, and he said, "Have you heard what's happened to the Eagle Bank?" And you say, "No, what? I have money in there. My life savings are in there." And he says, "You better get right over to the bank and take your money out because it's failing." And so as soon as you get up early in the morning and you go to the bank, and there's already a big crowd. You have to get in line behind all these people. And then, of course, you tell other people about it. And the bank fails because they can't handle all this sudden demand. So, but look at in the Panic of 1837, nobody said Panic of 1837. They were starting to talk about panics. In the Panic of 1857, now they're starting to talk about the Panic of 1837 and their own panic. And this is a constellation. They all go together, and they peak around 1907, the great panic when the Knickerbocker Bank failed, remember? and they founded the Federal Reserve then to stop it. To hopefully stop it, and the whole thing faded away. But you can see you can't have a bank run unless there's a narrative about bank runs. If nobody imagines there could be such a thing, it won't happen. So the real epidemic is the epidemic of attention to depositors panicking and pulling their money out. This is other confidence measures that went through epidemics. So they're all hump-shaped patterns. Well, sort of. Not an exact science here. And this is the Great Depression as a narrative itself. So the Great Depression, I don't know who coined it because I searched for it in databases from the 1930s. And some people said it casually. I don't think they were really naming it. In 1934, Lionel Robbins, a professor at the London School of Economics, wrote a book called The Great Depression. But it didn't catch on. This phrase didn't catch on. it started to catch on in the 60s and 70s. It's a slow, long epidemic of attention to. And then suddenly, wow, this is 2008. It shoots up. So they've named this recession, the 10 year ago big recession. They call it the Great Recession. That shows that they think it's the Great Depression happening again. Everybody was talking about the Great Depression, and so it's natural to call it the Great Recession. I'm just about. The other thing is there are narratives about conspicuous consumption versus frugality. It goes all the way back to ancient Rome, Greece, and China. They used to make sumptuary laws against living too high because it offended people that show off rich. On the other hand, we have Donald J. Trump writing books telling us, don't be afraid to boast of them. He did say that, if you can look in his, with co-authors. You have to boast or people won't know how great you are. So he's open with his philosophy of life about that. But there were people during the Great Depression, a lot of them who were emphasizing frugality. So Winifred Holtby, a columnist for the Manchester Guardian, said, dare to be poor. This was written in the Great Depression. In other words, can't we not use this period, the Great Depression, to get rid of a little snobbery and bunkum and live lives dictated by our own taste instead of our neighbors' supposed notions of what is done? I think that the Great Depression was substantially caused by people consuming less because they felt sorry for the people who were unemployed. And there were so many stories, sad stories, about malnourished children and all that. You're not going to buy a new car in 1932 when the old one is still working. So I can elaborate on that, but that's the basic idea. They were clearly starting to think that there's something called involuntary unemployment. So I do a search in books for involuntary unemployment. And you can see the term started to appear with the Depression of the 1890s, but it didn't. It's just been developing. It became important in the 1930s. It shot up in the 1930s, I would like to extend this to more recent. I think it's up now again, but we have very low unemployment now, so it's not going to be too high. Before this, they did talk about involuntary idleness, but they didn't have the word unemployment. The word unemployment wasn't coined until the Depression of the 1890s. And this is involuntary unemployment in news and newspapers. Huge increase in the Great Depression. It was a new narrative that wasn't your fault. When they said involuntary idleness, the word idleness suggests maybe you're lazy or shiftless or something. You're a loser. Unemployment now was not a loser. This was a serious problem. So the American, I'm out of time. Am I out of time? I'll try to get done in but no more than 5 minutes. James Truslow Adams wrote a book during the Great Depression, 1931, that coined the term American Dream. Nobody said American Dream before 1931. It is, I'm quoting him, it is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of a social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are innately capable, and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. I think it's significant that he said each man and each woman. That wasn't common in those days to say it that way. But he's also, it's not exactly now, it's our dream. It's where we're going in America. I guess we're still not there. But what it did, he didn't exactly say it, but what I interpret him to say is that America should be and will be the land of opportunity, where you have only to blame yourself if you don't succeed. And you might as well buy that big house and that big fancy car, because neighbors will be inspired by that. They'll see, if you can do it, I can do it too. And that's the American dream. So the American dream, poor Mr. Adams only saw the very beginning. He died around 1940. He only saw the very beginnings of American dream. Look what it's done in both books and news and newspapers. It's soared. It's become a source of national identity. And that's the conspicuous consumption justification. The last thing is technological unemployment or labor-saving machinery. These are a couple of terms that were popular in the 19th century. Labor-saving machinery refers to robots, but they didn't have the word robots yet. But you can see it had a hump-shaped pattern. Then we got technological unemployment. It's a new name for it, but a little bit different emphasis during the Great Depression. I think another major cause of the Great Depression in the 1930s was that people thought the day has arrived when machines will be more powerful than people. And from all this unemployment we're seeing, it's not going to go away. It's a major transmission. We call this the power age. The horsepower of the machinery on this planet is just enormous, like trillions of horses. And our feeble human bodies are just not needed anymore. That was the story. Turns out to have been wrong, because after World War II, the economy sprung back and everyone had jobs. But it had the impact on people's decisions to spend. If you think you're going to lose your job and never get it back, you're not going to buy that new car. It's another reason why not to. Even Albert Einstein believed this theory. Quoting him from 1933 during the Great Depression, "According to my conviction, it cannot be doubted that the severe economic depression is to be traced back for the most part to internal economic causes. The improvements in the apparatus of production through technical invention and organization has decreased the need for human labor and thereby caused the elimination of a part of labor from the economic circuit and thereby caused a progressive decrease in the purchasing power of the consumer." So he was not a professional economist. And maybe he was wrong sometimes, right? No one's superhuman. But I think that he's focusing. If he believed it, a lot of people believed it. And it's a reason why we had the Depression. So I'll just stop here. The future is, I think, that there will be a revolution in economics and finance attendant on the new databases that we have of digitized text. We already have books, magazines, legal briefs, economic news, and then we also, I think we're starting to get sermons and personal diaries. Be careful what you write in your diary, because someday it's going to be digitized and out there. But we'll learn more about what makes the economy change through time. So I'll stop with that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was inspiring. Einstein especially. I guess one question I have for you is that just, there was also Malthus who made bad predictions about humanity. Is one lesson that we will overcome everything and eventually just keep...
I'm an optimistic person, but not that optimistic. I think Malthus was right, but he just got the time frame wrong. Parson Malthus in 1799, I think it was, wrote a book called An Essay on Population, saying that population growth, that's similar. It's a horrible story. Will eventually make us starving. All of us will starve because the planet can only hold so many people. But I'm not going to argue the case. I think he didn't say when this is going to happen. People, that's the mistake is to think it's happening now. So if in 1799 you thought the world was getting overpopulated, you were wrong. But in another 300 years maybe. If something has to slow down birth rates because eventually there won't be standing room on the earth. So it's a question of whether he's right or wrong. I'm inclined to say Malthus was right, but in principle. Maybe it's not going to happen in our lifetimes, and maybe we can figure something out. I don't know.
Okay. What do you think about the markets or the economy today?
Well, I've been asked about... First of all, nobody knows the future. I think that the markets are highly priced, the stock market and the housing market and the bond market. So this isn't a good time to be an investor. You want to take that into your calculations when you figure out next time you're at a dinner party and people are talking about how much do you save for retirement, you're ready with thoughts about the answer. So yeah, but then I also think about narratives driving markets. And here I'm not when I talk about the depression of the 1890s, I can say something that you probably don't know. But you've all heard narratives about Donald J. Trump, right? So if I repeat, I think Donald J. Trump has helped encourage the market up and the U.S. economy up by his modeling the idea of being a conspicuous consumer. We just saw it with he has this Doral Beach Trump extravaganza he was boasting about. No other president has done that. No other president was apparently as rich as he is. But I think that modeling our behavior encourages us to show off a little bit more. Has it had that effect on you? Have you bought a new car recently?
I haven't. No. What is the biggest lesson that you've learned in your career about economics?
I guess I'm not prepared to answer that. There's so many little things that economics is not a monolith. It has, maybe it's diversity of people in there. I was president of the American Economic Association in 2016, and I had to select papers for the program. We had like 5,000 submissions, and it's impossible for one person to read them. I tried until I gave up. I was really impressed at how many different things people are doing. And critics of economics are making a mistake because they just don't know what all the things that are going on. But on top of that, it's what's going on in other departments. So I mentioned this Consilience. So my thought is that don't imagine that economists are all of one mold, or there's so many different people doing interesting things. When you start to try to scan the horizon, it's humbling.
So going back to some of your research, you wrote about the excess volatility, which kind of was your first big...
That's what I showed here.
The paper there. Can you, maybe you've explained it, but just sort of a narrative, if you will, a small narrative. Why is that so important?
Why is it important? Because it leads to a different model of the economy. The idea that I actually think that my diagram that I showed of the excess volatility for the aggregate stock market is a little bit misleading, because if you do the same thing for individual stocks, it looks better. Mm-hmm. That's because there's information about individual stocks. Whereas for the whole economy, there's information about it, but nobody knows how to forecast these things very well. So I actually think that maybe this isn't... Well, but it is important because it changes our conceptualization. If we think markets are perfect, we might be inclined to make some mistakes in our policy. On the other hand, I think we do have to respect markets. I wrote another book called Macro Markets, mm-hmm. That advocated having more markets than we now do, things for real estate or for career incomes and other odd things.
So speaking of that, you and Campbell wrote this P ratio predicting future stock market returns. Right. I think everyone here knows it.
Not everyone here.
Well, it's on TV all the time. So.
It's called the CAPE ratio.
The CAPE ratio. Yeah. And so my question is, how should we use it? If we're an investor, how should we apply this?
Yeah. So it depends on how serious an investor you are. And I assume that most of you are not serious investors. I'm not judging your faces. I'm just saying most people are not. You don't want to waste years of your life. So the first thing for most people to do is just diversify. And maybe with a value tilt. And you can toy around. You can even invest a little bit in Bitcoin if it makes you happy. Just don't put too much into it. But for professionals, for people who are really willing to get into it and put time into it, I think the CAPE ratio suggests being part of an investing strategy. But it may not be such a simple thing to know when to exit. And if the simplest thing is entering and exiting the aggregate stock market and moving into the bond market. So that's not so obvious how to do that. There's many different ways to implement that. right now, long-term rates are very low. So if you move out of the stock market into the bond market, you're getting a low return. So maybe you don't want to. I don't want to be overly definitive. It's not a simple thing. Also, things matter depending on who you are, and what your age is, and your circumstance.
Okay.
My big advice is get a financial advisor.
Following up on that, one of the things you've written about, and Paul Samuelson has said, I hope some people know who Paul Samuelson, the famous economist, you mentioned him tonight, has said that we, and this includes myself, we look at the stock market and say the stock market's always been up. So let's put all our money in the stock market. In 15 years, we're going to be fine. Don't waste your time with bonds and commodities. But you're saying to diversify. And so what would you advise, again, to people? Because it's similar to your story. We don't have a long history to look at of 30-year periods where...
That's a problem. You're investing. It's a lifetime problem, especially for you, for a freshman I just met. You could have another 100 years. Depending on medical progress, right? And all that. So what are markets going to do between now and 100 years from now? It's pretty hard to... You have to diversify. I don't know what else to...
But you would not do 100% equities, even if you have 100 years.
Oh, not 100% equities, no. Okay. Yeah, you have to, there's going to be crises and problems. Other countries have had their whole stock market disappear. Russia had the whole stock market disappear. And that's discomforting if you were saving that way.
Okay, now back to narrative economics, which I enjoyed your presentation. I read the whole book. And one of the things that I enjoyed the stories, one of the things that I was curious about is, and you addressed a little bit, but what if these stories are just coincidental and not causal? And how would we go about thinking about that?
That's the difficult thing. Now, in some sense, I'm arguing that economics is not an exact science, and it involves human judgment. Alfred Marshall said that in the 1890s. Economics is not an exact science because it involves people. And so I've started thinking, this relates to a newspaper column that you mentioned to me. I know this in the Washington Post, which got a lot of attention by Heather Long. And I know about this article because she interviewed me for it. And she mentions this book, which is good news for me. But she's saying that people have shifted toward the STEM fields and then also economics and finance, away from history and literature. But she shows in the article, or she refers to studies that show that in the long run, if you look at how you'll be doing in 30 years for a young student, it looks like people in those fields do just as well. So maybe we're too enamored of our own expertise in terms of living, and there's other perspectives. So I came across as advocating, I'm not saying you should drop your finance major. That's what you said you were. Finance major. Don't drop it. But take a history course, all right? And take a literature course. You're not wasting your time.
Well, history and literature are required in USF, though.
Okay. I'm sorry, what?
I think history and literature are actually required at USF.
It's required at USF, all right.
So that's good. That's good. On the right track. One comment about the economy. What do you think the most important economic problem is today, or the most important area economists should focus on in the future, other than narrative economics?
All right. Well, but this is just common sense. I would say income inequality, which is rising, and climate change, and maybe other environmental things like the potassium-nitrogen balance in the ocean, which you're probably not worrying about. And the things like that, the economists can explain why we don't have adequate, it's the public goods problem and the crisis of the commons. So we need economists, too, to think about these problems and propose solutions that may be more politically possible.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move to some personal experiences, some more lighter stuff. How did your life change How did your life change after winning the Nobel Prize, and what's the coolest thing that happened to you?
Yeah, so you told me this. I had a little time to think about it, but I don't have a good answer. This is a very subjective answer. The biggest moment with the Nobel Prize was I was thinking back on it, was when we were, all the Nobel Prize winners of 2013 were on the stage with the King of Sweden and the Queen of Sweden. And they had the Stockholm Philharmonic Orchestra playing. I remember what it was. It was Sibelius Karelia Suite, the Alla Marcia movement. Sorry. And I was sitting by myself thinking, I just won the Nobel Prize, and I don't have to do anything. I don't have to give a talk. I just have to go and bow to the king and get my gold medal. And I thought, maybe this is the happiest moment in my life. You should listen to Sibelius Karelia Suite, okay?
That's great. Who was a mentor of yours, and can you describe the greatest lessons that he or she taught you? And what are the greatest lessons that you have passed on to your students?
Again, that's a difficult question. I haven't prepared possibly right for that. But I was thinking of Paul Samuelson, who was my advisor at MIT. And he actually called me up like 20 or 30 years after more than 30 years after I graduated, and cautioned me about starting a futures market, which I was doing in housing. And he was saying that could be increase the speculation, and home prices could get even more volatile. And I was impressed that he called me up and he asked me to do something, but it wasn't for my good or his good, it was for the world's good. And that he remembered me after 30, 40 years. He was in his 90s then. So that's what comes to mind.
And what about a lesson that you've given a student?
Oh, well, the lesson I've given a student, I think that, this is just free associating, but I think they should be aware of the situation in the world now and understand that it's constantly changing and new opportunities are coming up. Don't follow your old plan. And maybe, as you mentioned, my books were lucky because I got them in. But I'm not sure that it was with my first edition of Irrational Exuberance, I was on a phone call with Jeremy Siegel at the Wharton School. And he said, you should write a book about this. It was his suggestion right now about the overpricing of the stock market. And I hung up the phone and I went for a walk by myself and I decided I'm going to do it right now because the market is going to. And then I wrote a book of predicting a stock market collapse. And my publisher told me, we'll have your book out in about 1 year. And I said, wait a minute, the market might, I've written a book predicting a market. And fortunately, I persuaded him to put a rush on it, and we got it out in several months.
Wow.
And lucky, because it came out exactly. Yeah. So it's life is like that, right? You have lucky moments. But it was a little bit of playing a hunch. It wasn't that I was not looking at received doctrine. I was just looking at evidence that seemed to contradict what economists were saying. And there wasn't too much lost of getting it out early. So I'd realized that downside risk is, the other risk is getting it out too late. Mm-hmm. So I think life is like that you do have to play sort of on hunches, but you should need to be reading scholarly works and to gain history and literature. And anyway, it's very general advice.
Okay, another advice question. Is there something that you learned from a family member that helped you in your career?
Okay, you told me this one too, and I don't know if I have a good. You said a family member.
Family member.
Well, my father was an entrepreneur. He took out a patent. He had an idea for an industrial oven, and he took out a patent on it, and he started a one-man company. He started hiring people to produce industrial ovens. didn't work. He had a heart attack and he dropped it. But I think I have the entrepreneurial. The nice thing about being a professor at universities is you can be entrepreneurial. So I started a company called Case Shiller Weiss Incorporated that produced home price indices, and we sold that years ago. Now, my mother, I think one thing that I learned from her was that she told me, we never as a family watched the Oscars or the Emmys. She said, it's just celebrity worship. She told me these celebrities are not so special. You have to recognize that there's other people and go for what's really good and ignore all this hype. And I believe, unfortunately, I don't have respect for some of you athletes or actresses or singers that other people might have.
So you don't watch the Kardashians?
I've never watched it. So maybe I should. I mean, when I write books about narratives, I should.
Out of all the accomplishments that you've had, which one are you most proud of and why?
Oh, I don't have a good answer to that. My 2 sons and 3 grandchildren. That's all I can think of. I'm proud of the Nobel Prize, of course, but I shouldn't be, right? That's another celebrity thing. Well, actually, it's not a celebrity thing because they give the prize to people who have made important contributions. Mm-hmm. Like the Haber process. You've never heard of it. This is the chemistry prize. So they gave to Professor Haber a prize for the ammonium process for making fertilizers. And it's estimated by, I don't know how accurately, that 1 billion people on this planet today owe their lives to the Haber process because it helped create the Green Revolution. There are other people like that, and they tend to... so that's why I think the Nobel Prize is a good thing. It helps redirect people toward genuine accomplishments. Not always. They make some mistakes, but...
Okay, let's move to some other types of questions. Then we're going to get to your advice for USF students at the end. How likely is a recession in 2020 or 21? This is an audience question, so you know who you are.
I got in trouble for giving... when you make forecasts, this is a short-run forecast. I'll say that if we're trying to predict for 2020, are we talking about the beginning or the end of 2020? You can extrapolate a little bit. With an unemployment rate of 3.5%, it doesn't look imminent. In other words, there are other factors that make it look imminent. Well, I've said that the probability, I've said this, but it's just a shot in the dark, that the probability of a recession before the 2020 election is about 50%. And I said a little under 50%. Well, I don't know. I'm just saying that it looks to me a little bit like we're in 2005. In 2005, home prices were slowing down, and they weren't falling yet. But there was talk, which I document in my book, about recession, about the collapse in the housing market, and it turned out to happen in 2008, 3 years later. So I was saying this looks like it could easily be, this is just a guess, that we'll have a recession in 3 years. And we'll slow down, we'll be slowing down. And the real estate market doesn't tend to crash suddenly. Neither does the stock market in terms of really big crashes. So I could see it happening in a few years.
Okay. So 3 years.
But it could happen before the recession, before the election too.
Wow.
I know that's important because presidents tend to get voted out of office if there's a recession.
The Ray Fair model, your colleague.
That's right, yeah.
So this is another...
He's not predicting a recession.
He's not, well, his is based, the economy.
He's predicting that Trump will win.
Okay. For those who don't know, Ray Fair is a Yale economist who predicts elections, and he's been pretty accurate, except for George Bush when Ross Perot ran. I think that's the only one he got
Also,
wrong.
he predicts the total vote, not the electoral college.
That's right, the popular. So here's another audience question. What economic narratives today are generally held that you believe may be misleading or incorrect about future events? Are they driving public policy discussions in a manner that may lead to poor future outcomes?
Yeah, I'm not prepared for this. You want one that's not true. I'm thinking of Donald Trump narratives, but I don't want to be political. So I don't know if I have. I'm thinking let me be more generic. Narratives like the artificial intelligence narrative, which is very strong now, has the potential, like other narratives, to be people to make a mistake in believing that it's happening right now. And people get this impression about robots happening right now. So, for example, the 1957-58 recession was called by some observers back then as the automation recession. That's another word for robots. And there was a nice movie starring Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn in 1957 called Desk Set, which was about a company that got a robot computer to replace the librarian in the company. And anyway, it's a nice, watch it. It's on the, you can see it on the web for free. But suddenly it seemed in 1957 like automation was eliminating jobs right now. So the perennial narratives typically have an element of truth to them. So the AI narrative is a narrative that's actually 2,000 years old. Aristotle in ancient Greece talked about machines replacing jobs. Why? Because it was happening, although on a small scale. But he talked about that being a danger. So I say don't panic too much with the next. The latest thing is they now have a computer that has an electronic hand that can solve Rubik's Cube. It hasn't created a scare, but I'm worried that there will be some scare that will make people think that it's happening right now and shock them out of their complacency. And then we could have a serious recession.
Okay, thank you. This question comes from someone who wanted to be named, Professor Mike Lehman, who was the professor of Jeff Silk, interestingly enough. And he said, in your view, what sequence of events led to the 1929 stock market crash and the onset of the Great Depression? But that's a big question.
It's a big
question. So just
question.
if you can, get it to its core. What caused the Great Depression, the stock market crash and Great Depression?
Okay, in 1929, May of 1929, Stuart Chase wrote a book called Men and Machines. He should have said Men and Women and Machines, but he didn't. That was 1929. That was 5 months before the 1929 crash. And he said that machines are replacing jobs. And he popularized the term technological unemployment. And he said it's happening now in 1929. Unemployment rate was not even calculated yet back then. And then they started to focus on it. So that's an example that comes to mind.
Okay. Dr. Shiller, what are your thoughts and opinions on what Mr. Svensson has been able to accomplish at Yale's endowment over the last 20-plus years?
Okay, David Swenson was a PhD in economics from Yale who invented the swap while he was on Wall Street, and then was hired back at Yale to manage their endowment, which was about $1 billion. Now, I'm not sure I looked today, it's close to $30 billion, all under the direction of one man who is thought to be an investing genius. So he seems very down to earth and common sense to me. I'm trying to understand how he was able to outperform just about every other endowment in the country. I'll say one thing, it is he listens well, he's down to earth, and I also think there's something about school loyalty. I think that if suppose you have an investing idea that you know is right, but you can't convince people because it's a little off, a little different, you bring it to him and he understands and does it. And he convinces the corporation at Yale that this isn't a crazy idea. And that is, so it's sort of loyalty and honesty that contribute to it.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 more, and some are quick, so hopefully still everyone's very intrigued. Who pays the cost of maintaining your database? That's a quick one.
Oh, my database on my web?
Yeah.
Well, until recently, I was doing it all myself. And I have a relation with S&P. They let me use some of their data. But now I have an assistant.
Excellent.
But I'm still paying it for it myself.
What are the biggest limitations of standard economic models and human decision-making that need to be addressed today?
Okay, I recommend that you read Danny Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is an excellent, it's a long book about behavioral economics.
I've read it.
Yeah. Right. Okay. And so he says you have gut feelings, that's thinking fast. Some of them, it's almost instantaneous. But you have to also think more slowly and care. That's a real glib summary of his book.
Okay, so read that. How many people have read that book?
Wow.
So, yeah, a lot of people. Okay, so I think this is the last question, which is, what 3 pieces of advice would you give to students at the University of San Francisco to be successful in their business career and their life?
Okay, this is very brief. Study finance. Even if you're not a finance major, it's about what you can do. It's how you make finance is the study of how to make things happen, as I view it. And secondly, study economics. And thirdly, maybe I'll have 4. Study history and literature and broaden yourself. And number 5 is seize the opportunity. That's according, in the words of Horace, the first century poet, carpe diem. It meant seize the opportunity.
Okay, well, thank you very much.